I want to thank all three of our panelists this morning. A lot of good food for thought. I was asked as the moderator to ask a couple of targeted questions to our panelists before opening the floor to all of you, who I'm sure have comments and questions as well. In the spirit of this workshop, of trying to identify some innovative and creative solutions to these challenges that we face in risk communication, I think I'd like to ask all three of the panelists to reflect a little bit on what steps or links or processes might pose the greatest challenge, in a sense, the greatest risk to successful risk communication. In your experience, Dr. Fischoff, for example, I was interested in the connecting or consultation cycle that you depicted. In your experience, is there a particular weak link there that should be the focus of our strategizing, should be the focus of our research, that would really help to advance the effectiveness of risk communication? In the case of decision science, what do you feel might be some of the opportunities to build this kind of science into the cycle of programs, to teach health professionals how to understand the decision making, the comprehension, the impactfulness of the messages that we are trying to create, and perhaps speed the cycle of that research under crisis conditions where time is of great urgency. And for Dr. Krebs, what do you see are some of the sort of the key weaknesses, or the flip side of that, the opportunities to bring research into the risk communication cycle and make it an integral part of planning and decision making? So big questions, but just an opportunity to reflect on where we might go with some of these important studies that we've done. Thanks.
Can I have her question?
Nope.
So maybe the biggest challenge is letting the problem get away. I think that the research suggests that you can explain most things to most people if you haven't lost control of the problem. The things that people need to know in terms of what are the uncertainties and what they can do and what's realistic, if you understand them and you do the work right. This is sort of known science. That's the reason I put up some of those old reports, because we've really known about how to do this, and the work began actually within the public health community during World War II and afterwards. But once the problem gets out of our control, then you have other people grabbing the mic who have other agendas. You have misinformation that gets out, and that's why I was so positive about the capacity building. Is that part of capacity building is viewing this as the communication, the two-way communication, the trust building, the getting the information, creating the information that people need as a strategic responsibility from the various organizations that needs really a relatively small amount of resources dedicated to it, but needs a commitment to think about communication from the beginning. I mean, you have communities like climate change, or in a very different area, the nuclear power industry, that sort of thought their story would tell itself and misplayed a very bad hand. Some of those things play out over very long periods of time, and once you've lost control, you're in big trouble. So I think getting on top of the communication and viewing it as a strategic responsibility that's probably the critical thing.
So I'm going to answer two parts of your questions that I can remember. So one of the components of this is thinking about who our audiences is and actually talking to the audiences. I think a lot of times we develop these communication tools or devices without talking with anybody or pre-testing them. And I think incorporating the public's view in this is really important. And in the study that I talked about, those three examples, we collected 14,000 responses in a month from 11 different countries. So you can do this really quickly using Amazon MTurk or Knowledge Networks or GfK Now. or Survey Sampling Incorporated, you can test different things to see how they're working with people and a diverse group of people. And I think we can take advantage of some of those things before doing these big, wide campaigns, is taking a step back and seeing how they actually work and have an impact. Because I think a lot of times when we develop these messages, what we think will work does not work, and it actually can have the exact opposite effect, the boomerang effect, to use your word, Dr. Krebs.
Yeah, I think the biggest issue is that people don't realize the complexity of the process. And so I think what we need to do is to figure out ahead of time ways of getting access to data. Even in the evaluation research realm, I think we depend way too much on survey research that does take a lot of time. I think there's a variety of ways of gathering data. Actually, the next slide I was going to show was about different ways of gathering data. I think there's a tremendous amount of archival data available, epidemiological data that are available, previous research and demographic data about different populations that we should be armed with ahead of time that allow us to move quickly and then to gather in depth. I'm really a big believer in qualitative analysis. I think that we should be doing more in-depth personal interviews with key informants and cultural informants from different groups to find out what's going on and building close relationships with them and finding ways to kind of keep the data going, keep the dialogue going throughout the process. I think if we can build those kinds of ongoing flowing data sources, we can be a lot smarter about the ways that we respond and also be a lot more adaptive than we've been in the past. Also recognizing that this is a process, not a product, that we need to kind of come up with different strategies that reinforce over time, utilizing a variety of different channels of communication and constantly evaluating to refine those messages. I think we can do a much better job at addressing moving and powerful and dangerous infectious disease problems.
So I have a few other questions, but I'll hold those back and turn the floor over to the participants. We have a little over 30 minutes remaining in this session, so I invite your questions and comments. Please. We seem to have two mics on the sides of the room. If you have questions, please move to the microphones. Thanks.
Damien Shallow, the World Federation of Science Journalists. About risk communication and collecting data. When you're in a crisis environment similar to what happened in Western Africa, it's a bit challenging. It's easier to collect the data after than prior to before. The infrastructure on site, and you don't even have to talk about, Guinea, Liberia, Sierra Leone. Even in middle-income countries, I would be challenged as a community of journalists, communicators to collect that data. So I'm just opening the question.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's a very complicated environment. That's why I think it's important to build a network of people who are part of that community who can provide you with ongoing data. One of the real values of the growing social media and digital environment is that people can post and provide information about their experiences. And we found in many cases in public health disasters and crises that these updates have been really critical. If you can find ways of getting information either through social media or television or context, I think observational data can be very valuable. Later on, you can do the more formal, more rigorous, large-scale analysis, but I think that getting the constant feedback is really critical for adapting your message and your strategy.
Yeah, so one of the things that Noel and I and Julie tried to do in this FDA group was to say how you could do in the FDA book was how you could do evaluation for no resources at all. That is, just in an open-ended way, let somebody tell you what's, a diverse group of people tell you what's on their mind, ask them to review your messages and say do a think aloud protocol, what comes into your mind. I think there's a tendency, we think data and then it gets expensive and then it gets time consuming, and the marginal utility of low quality data in a situation, as a protection against choosing to fly blind, can have great value, and you can get that, and anybody can do that if they're willing to be told that they're not trusted, their message doesn't make sense, they're talking to people in terms that they don't understand, that's a pretty high barrier for a lot of people to hear messages like that. But if you do it, you can do it fast with very little, at essentially no expense.
A related issue to that is a lack of expertise in data collection in a lot of the agencies. I really encourage the agencies to try to hire people who are good at collecting these kinds of social science data, can help them, guide them in the work they do. That's not really been a priority in the past. But I think that there's an opportunity to recruit students who are now developing expertise in this area to work. And I'm putting a plug in for all of my students.
I didn't know the meeting convention about the sign, the name sign, so let me.
I was given the floor. What am I doing here?
So, Kate Bond, and you may have just answered my question, but really what was going through my mind is what sorts of people, what sorts of resources are needed, and do we have some best practice cases that would help inform what Jeff should be doing about the various issues that he has going on from the point of view of if you're sitting there running that public health, what do you do? Who do you need?
Okay. Well, I mean, we do have a lot of cases. That was what we were, again, trying to do with that FDA book, just to make it accessible. To having, as Gary was saying, having anybody on staff who has this kind of capability, who can do a survey, do a qualitative interview, who can call up, we know how to talk to Gary, we don't need to talk to Angie about this, so that you have some sort of absorptive capacity, so an agency can talk to the rest of the world. I think the margin of utility of that is really quite large. And then, as I was suggesting, we know there's a lot out there. You could scale up, very quickly if it's done early. So.
And I can add to that. I think there's a lot of academics who would love the opportunity to collaborate, and I think a lot of times we almost have to start developing templates, right? So that when we're in the middle of a crisis, we already know what we're going to do. Yes, you have to change it a little bit based on the context, but we know, okay, if you use scientific terms versus vector, that is going to make people a little bit more scared. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but let's pretend it's a good thing, and it increases vaccination rates. If we can learn these things and do the science right now when we're less under threat, we can then, when we're under threat and when there is a disease, we can move those really quickly. And I think even though academics are sometimes, all those stereotypes, I mean, we're here to help, and we've been studying this, and this is all we think about day in and day out. And so I think there was a lot of people that would be willing to do that.
My research center has been doing a lot of training over the last 8 or 9 years. It wasn't really what we were planning to do. We basically were planning to do large research projects, but we had an opportunity to do some work with the Centers for Disease Control to train their program officers to do better message design, better evaluation research, better ways of using social marketing. And so we've been doing that a lot and building a relationship with that agency to help them. We also work with a lot of public health departments. About a month ago, I did a evaluation research training program for the New York City Public Health Department about ways that they could do a better job of reaching the very diverse audiences that they are working with. And one of the things we talked about were ways for them to bring in members of those audiences as ongoing advisors, as part of kind of a liaison to their communities, to let them know what the issues were, what the concerns were, and what the best strategies for communication. And I think if we can build that kind of capacity into a variety of different public health agencies, that we can really improve their response and also help them become more strategic about the ways they communicate.
Let me go back to the microphone, and then we'll come back around the table.
Okay, thank you very much. I would like just to share the experience. My name is Julienne Anoko. I would like to share the experience we did in Guinea, inside as UNICEF for the risk communication to solve this type of problem. First of all, we establish a partnership with the social science department so that social anthropologists were there working on the job with us, providing information from the community so that we were updating all our intervention on the job. And after that, we also hire a data manager analyst inside with us. His job was just to design evaluation tools. We undertook the rapid assessment before, during, after, so we were every day changing and changing and changing what we were doing. So this partnership can be built and resources be hired to work together with the team of communicators. Thank you.
Fabulous. I really applaud the work that you're doing. That's a great opportunity to use data to guide the work you're doing.
Please.
Ken Kester. Thanks very much. Really interesting series of opening presentations. We're going to be getting to a number of these topics today, later on today and tomorrow, but I want to make an observation and perhaps get some reaction. It's very clear we're operating in an era of rapidly moving communication strategies. Many of us work in large bureaucratic organizations. We have processes, procedures, academic pursuits, and we recognize, as we heard from the talks here, that still we struggle with this idea of getting the right word out to the right people in a timely manner to help influence appropriately decision-making, keep people calm, and et cetera. So given this change in this paradigm, especially when we're dealing with crisis situations, hot news, breaking news, you just open up your iPhone and there's breaking news from some website. When something happens and we want to put out the right information, and yet whether you call them citizen journalists, whether you call them purveyors of fake news, whether these are fiction writers or just liars, how do we try to deal with that? Because the point that was made in one of the talks is anyone paying attention? And if something happens in the metro, if I'm on my computer right now and I've got a flashy website, I get some stuff out there right now, and it may be all bunk. And we have to kind of be more thoughtful about this. So I recognize, this is going to be a continued discussion today and tomorrow, but I'm just curious, any reflections on that as we try to sort of think about how do we do this better and do it right?
I think one way we can address this is, and it might feel distasteful at some sense to do this, but we need to learn from the advertising literature, right? And for the websites that get people there. And then once we use those techniques to get people there, then we can give them the non-fake news and the accurate. But, a lot of times we try to say, oh, well, we don't want to learn from them. They're just trying to sell stuff. But in many cases, we are trying to sell stuff, right? We're trying to sell health news or a certain type of health behavior. And to acknowledge that literature and use that, I think, is the first step. Because, as we, back in the 1970s, when you got your news, you got it from one guy on, ABC, NBC, CBS, depending what kind of person you are. Now we get our news from 100 different sources, and we need to start learning from those sources to see what we can get, how we can reach people.
I think you've really hit on a really big issue, and one of the problems with our, burgeoning digital information environment. Last week I was in Beijing. I was meeting with the Chinese FDA, and they've been having exactly the same kinds of problems that you're talking about, where there have been a lot of false reports about food danger outbreaks. And they're very concerned about that. So one of the things they've done is they've set up a kind of a tracking network. They brought me into a room where there was a big wall full of computer screens that were tracking all of the social media, all of the news media, all the different information that was dealing with health risks. And they were able to very quickly, within 5 minutes of the new message, to analyze it, evaluate it, assess its accuracy, and provide responses as a way of trying to minimize the danger. And I think we're going to have to do the same kind of thing of not allowing false information to stand, but be able to respond to it quickly.
I might add that I think part of that rapid response, sometimes I think you all are trusted, and it's some sense it's yours to lose. And the question is, how do we move quickly enough? So we've been emphasizing how to have the communications there, how to have the communications people pre-positioned, part of your team, so that they can do the reconnaissance, and so the messages don't fall flat and lose trust. I think another part of that is how to get the information that people need when it's surrounded with uncertainty, so that you can answer their questions. That's why I put in the pitch for expert elicitation as something that there is a disciplined way that you can find out what people know and how great the uncertainty is. That information can be communicated as well, and can has some measure of protecting you against making promises that you can't fulfill, and then losing the trust. Just as it is difficult for many people not to trust their intuitions and assume that their message is the one that will deliver the public, there's another kind of resistance within the expert community of not wanting to, I'm thinking about the first talk this morning, of not wanting to say everything unless you're absolutely careful, and not wanting to say anything until you've clarified it, until you can qualify it within the standards of peer-reviewed publication, which is important in its own right, but doesn't serve the public health need.
One thing I think this is important to acknowledge, it's really important to talk to the experts, but often what the experts think are important to people are not what's important to the actual people. And to make sure, you see that in other diseases like breast cancer, for example, all the things that patients list in their top 5 are not in the top 5 of what their providers think is most important to them. And that's why you have to use both populations, the experts and the public, in deciding this.
And I want to build on what Angie was saying. I think a really critical factor in risk communication are who are the sources that different audiences trust. And in a lot of cases, most at-risk populations don't trust the experts. They don't want to hear from the head of the CDC. They don't want to hear from the Surgeon General. They trust local sources. They trust, groups that they communicate with. The paradox is that the people they trust often have the worst information. And so one of the things that we need to do as public health communicators is to build alliances with those trusted sources and provide them with relevant information. One of the areas where this has been a big issue is in childhood vaccination, where the, universally the trusted expert sources are saying that this is a wonderful thing, there's minimal danger, but then there are a lot of local sources saying, well, I don't trust this childhood vaccination, it's dangerous, it can hurt our children. Turns out that a lot of the moms believe their local sources more than the traditional ones. So my colleagues and I have been trying to figure out how do we tap into the groups that the moms trust. And we found out that many of the young mothers are very ardent audience members to mommy bloggers. And they love those mommy blogs and they believe them. But the mommy bloggers don't always have good information. So we've been feeding the mommy bloggers with good information and building relationships and helping them to come up with really good posts. And it's making a huge difference. And we've been using it now in a variety of different health risk situations. I think it's an idea of not only coming up with the right message, but providing it to people from people they trust on channels that they utilize.
Great, thanks very much, Lonnie King. Great presentations this morning. So the one thing we know for sure, and there's going to be more public health infectious disease crises. So my question is, how much should we or could we prepare in advance? So you've had a lot of information about feedback, about analysis of evaluations, about assessments. We kind of know what works and what doesn't work. So some of these are just variations of the theme. Realizing that the disease has some differences in them, obviously. So how much can we or should we do in agencies, information, universities, whatever, to plan ahead? Could it be 75%? Could it be 90%? How much of that should be done in preparation rather than just kind of, transactional responses with every crisis?
I think you got to distinguish between strategy and tactic. I think you can be really good at preparing strategy ahead of time and figuring out what's worked and what doesn't work, but then come up with specific tactics that are appropriate to the situation that you're dealing with. Every public health problem is different. things change over time. So tried and true methods that may have worked 2 years ago may not work anymore, but at least you have the strategy of, who are the key populations, what are the channels, and then you can refine them based on new feedback, but you're not really reinventing the wheel, you're building on previous work. So I think case studies, building strategy, building capacity, making connections within the community are really great ways to kind of spring load your response so you can do it quickly when the need hits.
Yeah, so I would say sort of absent strategy, every problem will get away. And somebody will seize the mic or nobody will seize the mic. So having a strategic commitment is, from as senior as possible within the organization is probably essential to these problems. And then having some sort of protocol where the first thing is that we listen to the experts, and then we listen to the community, and then we do some disciplined elicitation of what it is that people want, and then we prototype some messages, and we're set up so that we can get a rough response to that within 6 hours. And that's not impossible within the, with a modest source of resources. One does need people who have this kind of expertise that and you probably need more than one. That is, people just like each of you in our areas of expertise has a different set of ears. We know a different set of literature. We know people that you can, you can call, and we disagree with one another. So you would like, if you had the time, if one of us was your staff person. So one staff person goes a long way. That could say, I've got people, and I guess as Angie was suggesting, I've got people who are really interested in this problem. They're willing to be called in a drop of a hat. We're going to set up. We have sort of scoped out the problem in the first 5 hours, and we're going to do a webinar. We're going to do a research seminar and pick over the problems and let the senior people listen to what the social scientists have to say. I think one could do a lot for a little.
And the only thing I'll add to that, because I think that was beautifully said, was that we also need to do these evaluations in the middle of it, because I think a lot of times when we're testing these risk communication methods, I know, for example, my studies, it was in a hypothetical, it was during flu season, but there wasn't an outbreak. And so what we do and what we think is going to work when it's outside of that outbreak versus it might be very different, right? And so that is just another plug for doing some quick evaluation to see if things have changed over time or if these things are working right in the middle of a crisis scenario.
Great, thanks. I'm actually going to pick up on Ken's point because it seems to me we are in an extraordinarily transformative moment. We've seen it in the last election cycle. We saw it in the examples around Ebola. 4 a.m., a very noted public figure is tweeting about sort of an hysterical response to Ebola. I'm just wondering, to the extent it's, the focus on getting the message right is important, but it's not clear to me that we're having a systematic approach to trying to stay ahead of the curve of the power of social media. And it's the good, the bad, and the ugly. We've seen, absolute false information. DC was a recent example of how false an absolute lie is believed. You can go back to 2009 and you can see just how misinformation about the H1N1 vaccine in Germany led to an extraordinarily large rejection of that vaccine, risk communication. But it was all generated and driven by social media. So I take your example. I mean, China's an interesting place to be able to harness that. I'm not sure that we have that same ability, but the issue is, how can we, you say, get ahead of the curve? How do we, in fact, get ahead of the curve when, in fact, you've got this incredibly democratized sort of ability to communicate anything you want to everyone, and it's only a few voices that really are speaking with a knowledge base? And I'm just concerned as we go over the next 5 years, it's only going to get progressively worse. And do we have a grand strategy as thoughtfully put together as your strategies for about getting the right message, but do we have the right ways of staying ahead of the misinformation curve?
No, I think we're at the very early stages of this digital revolution, and things are going a little bit screwy now because we haven't figured out how to work this stuff. And there are a couple loud, squeaky voices that are making trouble. But I think that over time, people will become more literate about their use of social media. And I also am a big believer in the wisdom of the crowd. One of the really cool things about social media is that there are many voices. And we found this in online support groups, that there was a great fear in online, cancer support groups, that some members would give bad information out about what people should do. But we found very quickly that other members of the group would jump in really quickly and say, no, that's baloney. That's not right. Here's the latest information. And they would rectify the information because they were knowledgeable and they were involved. And I have a feeling that within social media communities, there'll be more watchdogs who will spring up and will provide instant background and out people who are providing bad information. I think it's slow to happen now because people may be reticent, but eventually I think we'll become better and better at doing that, and we'll limit the number of these really bad, untrue, and dangerous messages. At least I'm hoping that's what'll happen.
That's great.
With all due respect, I might disagree with that, and I actually really worry about that as we're getting more and more polarized and our sources are becoming narrower and narrow. We have a lot of sources, but within our communities, I think that's why there was a lot of people who were surprised about this election result and a lot of people who were not surprised by this election result. It depended on what you were reading and how you were reading. And so I think, I don't have a good answer for you, and I apologize for that, but I think we need to really understand, and I think in cases where the cancer forms, I think that exactly happens because there is a lot of really good facts, and people are a small community. It's a relatively small community, but when we can have, on things where people might not know as much and they're going more by gut and intuition than on facts, which is different than the cancer example, I think we're at a real threat for a lot of misinformation, especially in moments of hysteria. And so I think that's one thing that we really need to be thoughtful about because it's just, as Dr. Krebs said, it's just gonna get bigger and bigger, this use of social media, and as you said, and we have to start studying and paying as much attention to that as we're studying how we communicate the information.
So in this panel and earlier, there's been a number of comments about the importance of early communication, even in the face of uncertainty. And one thing I wonder about and makes me nervous about that is how much we know about the risks of being wrong. Certainly, whenever there's an evacuation for a storm, the people who stay behind say, well, the last time the weatherman said there was a storm, there wasn't. And we now have a president-elect who said, well, when the CIA warned about weapons of mass destruction, they were wrong, and therefore I'm not going to believe them this time. So it seems like the stakes are high, and we have been wrong as a public health community about certain threats and risks in foodborne diseases and infectious diseases. If we communicate because we need to communicate early and then we're wrong, do we run a major risk of undermining confidence the next time?
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead.
I guess the decision science way to think about that is, so there's two questions. So one is, if we don't say anything, then somebody else will say something and we end up with the situation we've just been talking about. And then the analytical question is, what can we say that's responsible and defensible, and the behavioral question that is pertinent to people's needs, including how quickly do they need better information, when will that better information come? And then I guess the behavioral question is, can we convey that in a nuanced way to people who are willing to listen? So in some ways, I think the analysis may be more difficult than the psychology there, of coming up with a responsible situation that will then, a responsible summary of the uncertainties and the way it's likely to unfold.
I guess the only thing I would say, I agree, and that's something that we need to better understand. What is the implications if we get it wrong, right? And how does, so, and I wasn't necessarily, because I talked about the uncertainty, saying that we should go in early before we have information. but we're never going to have enough information, right? It's in the middle of an outbreak, right? There's always going to be questions and uncertainty, and we shouldn't be paralyzed by that uncertainty, but we have to be as careful as possible, obviously, because I think it will have downstream effects if we're completely wrong frequently.
Over the last year, I've been doing a lot of work with joint information centers that are designed to respond to crises and provide public information. And the suggestions and recommendations we're giving them is to try to provide good information as quickly as you can in times of a crisis, but to say this is the best information we have now, but we're going to provide you with regular updates. And that, be aware that we're going to keep monitoring the situation, and as things change, we'll provide you with updates and recommendations. But for what the evidence shows now, this is the best strategy. And but a lot of times in crisis response, we think it's a one-time, one-shot message, and we're not establishing a dialogue. And if you let people know that you're using your best judgment based on available information, and that you're seeking more information to update that, I think they'll be more willing to listen to you and adapt over time. I think they get bent out of shape when you come out and say, this is it, this is what we need to do, you need to do it right away. And then later on say, well, I guess I was wrong, because they thought they had the definitive answer. So I think we need to kind of frame the information as, this is the best available advice, we're going to track this and we're going to update it as we go.
Though I would add that that's what we try to do in this study, to use exactly the language you just quoted, and it actually decreased people's risk perception and their interest in vaccination. And I can't remember the trust data, but I think it actually had a little impact on trust, but don't quote me on that. So I think it sounds like a great idea, but in these 11 different countries, people that had the opposite effect than we had hypothesized.
So here's a story, an upbeat story. So it was some years ago, I was on EPA's Scientific Advisory Board, and we heard a talk from the head of the Des Moines, Iowa Water Board. And Des Moines had the largest loss of water before Katrina in sort of in modern history. And I forget his name, but this was the communication strategy that he improvised. He said every 12 hours he stood in front of the mic. He issued no press releases because he was afraid that the words would be interpreted. And he stood in front of the mic. He said, this is what we told you what we understood 12 hours ago. This is what we promised to do. This is what we learned. And I'll take questions as long as you want. And he had a country song written after him about him. So an aspiration for us all. So.
Thank you. I wanted to follow up a little bit on what Lonnie said, because when we have emerging health situations and outbreaks, there's a tremendous pressure immediately from the media to answer questions, right? They'll come to health departments, they'll go to academia, they'll go to the public and put microphones in front and ask a lot of questions. So I really respect the need to do research and to get feedback from the community and to do evaluation. But in practical, world that I live in, we're asked to start communicating immediately at time zero. And so I wanted to get your advice on what principles we should use in that context before we have the luxury of having, research, participatory research results and evaluation of messages and testing of messages and decision and science input. In guiding our communications early on. And then secondly, how generalizable are the findings about attitudes, perceptions, cultural beliefs, behaviors from one incident to the next? Can we use the results from one outbreak in formulating our empirical response, a priori to the next one? And then finally, where do you see all this research happening in our chaotic, sort of unstructured system? At the local public health level, at the federal level, at the academic level, at private level? I mean, who's doing the research and how's it getting packaged and delivered to those who are actually doing the communicating?
Right. Let's see if I remember your three questions. The first one is that I think that at ground zero, you need to communicate with the audience, especially if they're frightened. Every time you communicate, you're communicating on both the content level and a relationship level. You may not have all the content at that point, but it's a great opportunity for you to demonstrate compassion, concern, involvement, build your trust with that community, seek information from them, let them know what you know now and what you hope to learn. So you're kind of setting them up for building a relationship. I think as the crisis moves forward and things become more apparent and we learn things, you can update that. But if you've established that relational, basis for collaboration and cooperation, I think your communication is likely to work more effectively. The second question is, remind me.
So one was, what can we do a priori? Where should we start? Second question was, what's generalizable? And the third is, where does all this happen?
Well, actually, I'm most familiar with the academic research. It appears that a lot of the agencies are very busy doing the response. They're not doing a lot of evaluation. There are some advisory boards like the FDA Risk Communication Advisory Board that does reflect and evaluate and provide recommendations, but generally that's not the case. I think I would probably look at academic organizations. There are also a number of large research organizations that do ongoing reports and evaluation that are kind of often are in league with the academics that provide good information. But I don't always see that information filtering to the people on the firing line. And so we need more opportunities for forums, for training, and for consultancies to make sure that that information gets implemented. And then the third one.
What's generalizable from what's already known?
I think that was the issue about, will the same responses that worked before work in this situation? And I think the answer is generally yes, but specifically no. So it's the strategy and the tactic issue that I think you can learn a lot about the audience and the way they responded in the past, but you've got to reflect on the nature of this unique situation and also how things have changed over time. So I think that you can learn from previous precedent, but I would be very reluctant to implement a policy in exactly the same way for a new incident because it's a different situation. It's kind of like, it was at the notion, every time you step into the river, it's a different river. It's the same thing in a crisis situation, and you've got to react to those differences. Cahill Gibran, I think it was.
I'll address a couple of your questions. When we did our study with different risk communications, one of the things we were concerned about is what how it worked across different types of people, right? And so that's one of the reasons why we did it in 11 different countries, so North, South, East, and West Germany, UK, and the US. And there was little blips of differences here and there, but it was pretty similar across all of those countries, which differed quite a bit, right? So Poland is very different than the Netherlands, for example. In addition, we found pretty consistent, we measured, because we're psychologists, 836 approximately individual differences: trust in science, politics, religion, age, gender, race, literacy, numeracy, blah, blah, blah. And there weren't huge differences even across people. There's, again, some here and there. So I think a lot of at least the ways we were doing this was pretty consistent across different types of populations. And we actually have a study that will probably go in the field in the next 6 months looking at different risk communication techniques for MERS, which is something that a lot of people don't have expertise, or it's not widely talked about, Ebola, Zika, and influenza, to see if the same exact messaging works in those 4 different domains. And so, if you want, I can get back to you in, 7 months.
So just a quick it seems to me that is the leadership challenge, not to be in a situation where you're flying blind. And I had the opportunity to work last year I had an Army War College fellow, a colonel who was interested in bringing solving the same problem in the intelligence community. She's now in charge of analytical modernization at one of our intelligence agencies. And she had the idea of, in her terms, a decision science wingman. That is somebody, an aide, an aide to the person who's speaking and saying, how does this sound to you? What do we know about this? What should I avoid because we don't know how to do this message? So that's one potential model, who's then kind of connected with the community of researchers who kind of know what generalizes and what doesn't.
I'm looking to the organizers. Do we have time for one more question? Please, Edward.
So good morning, Ed Yu from the FBI. Thank you very much for the presentations. I'll admit right off the bat that I'm out of my depth here, but one thing I wanted to consider is how do we push things further left of boom in preparation, especially when you're talking about such very disparate communities, and the different situation is going to be so fluid. But what happens if the population is somewhat empowered? So things like duck and cover, stop, drop, and roll, or in California, having an earthquake preparedness kit, where they have a vested interest, and the situations will be somewhat fluid. But is there a public health equivalent where you have that kind of understanding and therefore that kind of potential, anticipation and a prepared response that could be somewhat general in nature? But you say duck and cover, and it resonates with everyone because there's a vested interest in what the risk and threats are. But is there a public health equivalent?
I think that vaccination is the only one I can think of, is that we have this system that we've established ahead of time for people to protect themselves from different types of infectious diseases with vaccination. And so that's become a kind of a standard operating procedure. And then I think that there's a kind of when there's crises, that people will look to leaders of public agencies and news reports to guide them. But I don't think there's a lot of very specific strategies that maybe we can do a better job of preparing different publics with evacuation strategies, with strategies for staying in place, other kinds of issues that might work for them. In the situation of Katrina, there was not a really good established strategy for people to leave their homes, and they were reluctant to do it. And it was very difficult to encourage them to do it because it wasn't part of their experience. And had they done better planning, maybe that would have been an easier process and would have saved lives.
We heard a comment over here about a network that's in place that, as I understood, is founded on listening, not just telling. And maybe we need that kind of social network. It would be a model that we should hear more about.
The only thing I would say is I think that is a really novel way to think about this, and it's curious if we could do that, given how a fire is a fire is a fire for the most part, and so it's easy to have that one singular message. Whereas these diseases, what you do is very different as you progress. Early on, you just want to keep, you might just wash hands or et cetera. Versus then there's a vaccine available. Then there is, maybe in extreme cases, staying at home or sheltering at home or what have you. But I think that's a really great challenge for our community to really think through. Is there a quick message that would get at it? Because obviously what we're doing for vaccinations is not working as well as we would want. Ann Arbor is one of those great hotspots where you got a lot of really smart people and a lot of really unvaccinated children. And so, and you see that in California, you see that where you these very educated people. So whatever we're doing is not working for all populations, and we need to think that through. But I think that's a great idea.
So we're past our allotted time. I want to thank you all for your attention during this session and for your thoughtful questions. And please join me in a round of applause for our three panelists.